We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet to share these conversations on the Vegan Compass podcast.
We extend our respect to elders past and present, as well as any of our listeners and guests. Hello and welcome to the Vegan Compass podcast, unveiling truths, inspiring change. We are your hosts, Rick Allport and Mackenzie Cross.
From wherever you're listening, please be sure to like and subscribe to support this podcast. Now to the episode.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Vegan Compass podcast. Your favourite co-hosts, Mackenzie Cross and Rick Allport with you this morning.
How are you this morning, Mackenzie?
I'm not too bad. One of us is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. The other is a little hungover.
Yeah, I'm not gonna sort of point to who that may be.
I was gonna let people guess for themselves, but you've just made it
I would
obvious.
have guessed you were the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed one, Mackenzie.
Well, that brings us to our wonderful guest here today, and we're very thrilled to have her here. We have Katrina Love, and Katrina Love has a huge background. So, Katrina, our first two questions for you: who are you, and what do you do?
I guess essentially I'm an animal activist and an animal advocate, and I have been for about 20 years now. I've been vegan for 15 years, and I've been very heavily involved in the Live Exports from Australia campaign for 20 years, and also heavily involved in the Animal Justice Party from about 2012 to recently. Still a member, but was a state convener for 10 years, nearly 10 years, and national vice president for 4 years. I have been involved with the Animal Justice Foundation since its inception in 2020. And but the main thing I think you got me on to talk about was live exports, and I've been in a paid position with Stop Live Exports, which is a Fremantle-based grassroots community organisation that was formed in the 1990s. I was campaign manager there for 10 years up until last year, and now I'm pretty much retired, and all my work is, apart from my own business, is voluntary. And I'm still very heavily involved in the live export campaign, and I consult to a lot of other animal organisations within Australia and a little bit New Zealand, and I do that on a voluntary basis. So just research facts for them, provide historical and current data, mainly on shipping, the vessels, the ports, the mortality rates, all that kind of stuff. So I help anyone who wants help with that. I help them out.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing a little bit of the backstory. You're definitely someone who is very involved in the movement, and we're so thankful for the work that you do. But today we really wanted to do a deep dive on live exports because you are probably someone with the most knowledge about this issue in Australia. So why not tap into your expertise?
One of them, yeah.
So could you start off by telling us about the live animal export industry in Australia for anyone who doesn't know what that involves?
Sure. I grew up in Sydney and spent the first 30 years of my life in Sydney. So I actually had no idea that the live export trade existed until I moved to Perth and then Fremantle. We've been exporting live animals from Australia since the 1820s, but it really hit its straps in the 1960s when we started exporting sheep to Kuwait. And then that was the main trade, live sheep to the Middle East, followed by the live cattle trade to Indonesia, which came about in the noughties. Essentially, there are 4 arms of the live export trade. They're kind of 4 different industries, really. There's the live sheep and cattle to the Middle East, sheep being the biggest proportion of that. There's a northern cattle trade to Southeast Asia, where Indonesia and Vietnam are the biggest consumers. There's the dairy cattle trade, which was big to China and Russia, and they're very long-haul voyages. Thankfully, that trade has died down. There haven't been any shipments to Russia since 2020, and this year only 28,000 dairy cattle have gone to China, and that was in January. So the year before, there was about 80,000 cattle went to China, so that's a significant reduction. And what we're hearing is that the Chinese market is kind of flooded with milk, and they're not really as interested in buying breeding heifers, which is why it's going to be hard for New Zealand to start up that trade again, because there's really no demand for it, hopefully. Then there's the live animal exports by air, which is mostly breeding animals, breeding and slaughter goats, breeding and slaughter sheep, breeding cattle, breeding llamas, alpacas, and camels. All get shipped by air from Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, and Adelaide.
Wow, this
Yeah,
that's just blown me away. Like both Mackenzie and I have been like in a small level doing band live export just from being MCs at events and those sorts of things. I have had no idea that to the extent of it, and of course the air live export is just something that blows my mind. It's just crazy.
Yeah, look, there are two sides to it, I guess. It would be very noisy and very traumatic in the cargo hold of a plane, but it's also a very short flight, and the mortality rates on air transport are very low, nearly always zero. So, if I was having to go from one country to another, would I rather be tracked, cramped in a hull of a ship with 50,000 other humans, or in a crate on an aircraft for 14 hours or 8 hours or 5 hours, wherever they're going? A lot go to Malaysia, a lot go to Philippines, a few to Singapore. But the bulk of the live animal exports from Australia are by sea, and they're for slaughter, and that's Southeast Asia and the Middle East.
So you've been involved in live exports, as you said earlier, for many years. What actually brought you into this campaign?
When I moved to Perth, it was about 2003 actually, so I'd been in Perth for 13 years, and a friend of a friend was involved with Stop Live Exports, and they were having a protest in Forest Chase in the city. And she said, "Oh, you should, get along to that. You might find it interesting." So I went along to this protest, and it was just, it was a moment in my life that changed the direction of my life. I had no idea about live animal exports. I did a deep dive into it, and I just enmeshed myself in it, and I found out everything that there was to know. I volunteered at stalls, at handing out leaflets. I started doing the social media for Stop Live Exports. I started monitoring all the ships that were coming to Fremantle, and in those days it was often 3 a week, and they would carry over 100,000 sheep would be loaded onto them. These days it's around 50,000 generally, and the ships are smaller. The fleet has been, weeded out. The worst ships have been weeded out. So that's how I got involved. And then I ended up on the committee for Stop Live Exports for a few years. And then when the campaign manager, the paid position became available, I applied for that, and because I knew more about live exports than anyone else in the organisation, I got that position. And then the live export campaign was a catalyst really for me becoming vegan in about 2009, when I sort of realised the hypocrisy of campaigning to stop the cruelty to these sheep and cattle that were being sent overseas for slaughter. And then I found out what happens in our own slaughterhouses, which is, not quite as bad, and they're spared the voyage, but nothing nice happens in any slaughterhouse anywhere in the world.
Yeah, definitely. Would you mind touching on some of the animal cruelty concerns during the voyage, and then also upon arrival in these overseas slaughterhouses? Because as you just mentioned, there are different standards in different countries.
Sure. Start with the northeastern cattle trade to Southeast Asia. So when that, you might remember when A Bloody Business came out in 2011, the expose by Four Corners that followed up on Lynn White's work with Animals Australia, filming in about 7 Indonesian slaughterhouses over the preceding 2 years. And when that came out, the public was outraged, of course. The then Labor government suspended the trade. They tried to ban the trade to Indonesia, but it turned into a suspension of about 5 weeks. And born from that was the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System, SCAS, which was introduced first in Indonesia and then, grew to all other countries that we export live animals to. And I'm the first to acknowledge that when industry makes an improvement, I'll acknowledge that they've made an improvement. It doesn't change my mind about the the essence of the trade and that it has to stop. But stun rates in Indonesia went, at the time that was filmed, there was one slaughterhouse in Indonesia that was using stunning on cattle, even though it was halal slaughter, and that was the Elders slaughterhouse. And then after this expose, the stun rate in Indonesia has grown from 10% to 90%. So it's now about 10% of cattle that are not being stunned. And that stunning has made improvements for other cattle too, both local and imported from other countries. So I just want to preface this by saying I'm going to talk about slaughter, I'm going to talk about meat, I'm going to talk about chilled meat, but I'm an ethical vegan, have been for 15 years. And that doesn't mean I condone it. I'm just pragmatic, and this is what happens. And I just like to stick to the facts and steer away from emotion. But the concerns in Indonesia were maintained because there were breaches of SCAS. There were cattle that were still being treated the way we saw in that footage, with tail breaking and eye gouging and rope tripping and kinds of slaughter that they weren't supposed to be doing anymore. But I've got to say that has died down a lot. And the main agency there that was overseeing all that, or who was investigating, was Animals Australia, an unpaid, charity organisation, was doing the government's work. So that was the main cruelty issue, firstly in Indonesia, and then in Vietnam, who became another big importer of cattle from Northern Australia. Being a non-Muslim country, mainly Buddhist and Christian, they didn't, need to follow halal rules for slaughter, but the cultural habit for slaughtering large animals in Vietnam was stunning them with a sledgehammer. And we saw a lot of footage of that happening to Australian cattle, and trade was stopped there for a while. And it was repeated for a few years, but that's the trade's probably been ongoing to Vietnam for about 10 years. So I've got to say that the SCAS breaches that are being caught or recorded or reported have dropped dramatically in pretty much all countries. And then the cruelty issues in the Middle East are, of course, that all animals that go there, with the exception of a very few that might go to a government facility in Jordan, are stunned prior to throat cut, and that are not stunned prior to throat cut, and that includes cattle and sheep. And Israel is particularly bad for cattle because they use full inversion slaughter box, which are banned here in the UK and in the USA because of the trauma they cause cattle. Mm. So they're the slaughter concerns. And then, of course, there's the on-board concerns for the long-haul voyages, not so much Indonesia and Vietnam. The journeys, the voyages there are generally, depending whether they go from, Portland or Fremantle or Darwin or Townsville or Broome, between 4 and 7 or 8 days, whereas all the voyages to the Middle East are generally 14 to 21 days, not including the loading. So it's a long-haul voyage. They only have one vet on board. Records have shown, from the independent reports. I did a deep dive into the independent reports from 2018 to 2022, and they showed that even after the moratorium on live sheep exports to the Middle East, so that prohibition period of June to September, that sheep going in all other months of the year were still suffering from heat stress. 75% of those voyages that had sheep on board and independent observers had A-cell breaches that included, but were not limited to, withholding feed and water from the sheep, mouldy or dirty feed and water, incorrect or incomplete euthanization, insufficient space, too long fleece length. I mean, all these are all A-cell standards that they are supposed to comply with. And also sheep were dying or had died from, not a lot, but a few had died from shearing cuts and dog bite wounds. Now, those sheep should not have been loaded. And the other one was pregnant ewes. Giving birth on the ships, pregnant ewes also should not be loaded. So when the industry says we've cleaned up our act and we've lowered the mortality rate, they have indeed quite substantially lowered the mortality rate, but there's all these other issues that they just gloss over.
So you say that there is only one vet on board. I thought that they were going to be bringing in that, they needed more than one vet, but also what sort of vet can actually see these animals in such horrific conditions and say, hey, no, that's all A-okay?
Well, I guess vets that are paid by the industry. That's, their job. The industry pays them. And I'll add that vets aren't on board every shipment. They're supposed to be on board all long-haul voyages, but there were a lot of shipments of dairy heifers to China that didn't have a vet on board. They're not normally on the voyages to Southeast Asia. So it's, and it's always one vet, and I think there was one or two voyages to the Middle East that didn't even have a vet on board. So that responsibility of observing animals and diagnosing and treating is left to the stockmen and women that are on board the ship, and administering medications and often euthanizing.
Gosh, so someone who doesn't even have the qualifications to euthanize an animal is doing that if there's no vet on board.
Yeah. And there have been some disgusting conditions we've seen on board, but I'll add that not all shipments are like that, and there are some shipments, depending on the length and the weather and the ship and the crew and the vet, that are, I guess, what the industry would call faultless, and you couldn't take footage on one of those voyages and say, look at this, it's disgusting, because they go, well, it's clean, they've got feed, they've got clean water, no one's dying. Okay. But still, it's a more traumatic outcome for all animals. As soon as they step foot on a ship, they're subjected to, rough weather, maybe heat stress, the unpredictable patterns of the ship as it heaves and haws and rolls and sways, and there's 24/7 fluoro lighting, so they can't even get a dark night to sleep in. And there's, of course, the noise from the engines and the ventilators, which sometimes when the ships were in port in Fremantle, you could hear them from a kilometre away. So pretty loud on board.
I actually did a little bit of a deep dive into some of the footage that the live export people have released. And they say, oh, look, they've all got room to lie down or rest. And I'm looking at their footage going, no, they don't. And
No, they haven't.
yeah, and they're walking around in their own feces, and I'm thinking this is the actual footage that they're putting out as good footage.
As the example of how well they're doing things.
Yeah, it's just mind-blowing. But okay, so fast forwarding now to just recent times, the Albanese government have declared that they're going to ban live sheep export. Where do we sit on that? Is it going to actually happen? What does this look like?
Yes, so they went to the 2019 election with that policy, and unfortunately they didn't get elected. And in 2022 they went to the election again, introducing that policy very, very late, like just before the election basically. They were elected, and they state that that gives them a mandate to go forward with that policy, which they have been true to their word, and they did it fairly quickly. They organised an independent phase-out panel. They invited submissions to that panel, and then that panel, after almost a year of reading all the submissions and investigating and talking to slaughterhouses and producers and stock agents and shearers and all that, made a recommendation to the government about the time frame to phase it out in. So they decided on 1st of May 2028, all of the animal organisations that talked to the government recommended that we would like to see it phased out by the 1st of January 2026, but industry was going for 20 years, so we think it's a pretty good compromise to get it done in 4 years. So, yes, they have followed through with that. The legislation passed in the upper house, of course, because Labor has a big majority, and it passed narrowly in the Senate in May, I think, maybe June. So the legislation is enshrined in law, and the Liberals and the Nationals are saying if they get elected next year, they will reverse the ban and they will rescind that legislation, but that's much more complicated than it sounds. They would need to table their own bill, and that bill to reverse the legislation and allow live sheep exports from Australia to the Middle East would have to pass both houses again. Right. So not an easy thing. I can't see them getting elected, touch wood, with Dutton and Littleproud as the glorious leaders. And on a policy of nuclear, which I actually support, but a lot of Australians are scared of, and bringing back a trade that the majority of Australians have demonstrated they oppose, and also a lot of Liberal voters oppose.
Now, why only cattle? Why only sheep? Because, what about cattle and the other animals?
Labor they've committed to sheep only. They've said they will not ban live cattle exports from Australia, and the main reasons are that the live sheep exports to the Middle East are the worst of the worst. I would add the live cattle exports to the Middle East as well because of the method of slaughter and the voyages. The hope is that when the live sheep trade to the Middle East ends, it will become financially unviable to send, 500, 600,000 sheep are sent there every year, but only about 70 to 80,000 cattle. So the hope is it will become financially unviable to send shipments of 3 or 4 or 5,000 cattle to the Middle East without those 50,000 sheep, filling the ship. The reason they won't currently ban live cattle exports in the whole, which is like mainly the northern cattle trade to Southeast Asia, is because it's much more profitable than the live sheep trade. The live sheep trade is currently worth, depending on who you ask, between 50 and 70,000, the live sheep by sea trade. The live cattle trade is worth about 1.3 billion. So it's worth a lot more. A lot more people rely on it. The argument is that they can't do anything else with the land in Northern Australia. It's only good for grazing cattle. And then the other factors are that the voyages are short, the mortality rates are low, and the stun rates are high. So it's just not as horrendous as a trade to the Middle East. So it might die, an organic death based on, the shipping problems that we can foresee in the future. It might die based on carbon emissions and environmental concerns. Labor might be able to be talked around, but at the moment it stays, and it's of concern, of course, any animal getting on a ship and being taken to a foreign country for slaughter, but it's not as great of a concern as the trade to the Middle East.
Well, I'm sure we're all hoping that it gets banned.
Sure.
So the industry and some outspoken politicians, who you named a couple of them before, argue that an end to live exports from Australia would result in other countries with lower welfare standards picking up that trade and deeming millions more animals to suffer. So is there any truth to that argument, or I guess what do you have to say about that?
The only truth to that argument really is that, and I hate saying this, but there is no other country that actually imposes the standards that Australia does when exporting live animals, and that's saying something because we've seen how bad they can get. There's no other country that regulates to the standard we do, and still we have the horrific footage that we see coming onto our screens. But what my counter to that, or my rebuttal of that argument, is that there are already around 100 other countries that export live sheep. There's a handful that export many more than we do: Romania, Spain, Sudan, and a few that export around the same amount as us. So they don't not export because we do. They're not waiting in the wings for us to stop so that they can start exporting sheep. They already export sheep. We don't currently have, we never have had, and we never will have any control over the conditions on board the ships they use. So the conditions won't get any worse if we leave, and they won't get any better if we stay. We have no influence over that. All we've had an influence over is the facilities that Australian sheep go into, where they're slaughtered, held and slaughtered. And for the most part, those improvements will stay because they're good for the bottom line and they're good for the workers.
Mm.
So they're not going to suddenly go back to the old ways because we leave. And also you have to remember that most of the countries that are touted to replace Australia or pick up the trade that we drop, which is a very small trade of about 500 to 600,000 sheep, the voyages are much shorter, and they're shorter to the tune of, maybe Sudan to Jordan is 1 to 2 days rather than 17 days. Romania to Saudi might be 5 days instead of 15 or 16 days. So I ask myself, well, is it better to be on a shitty ship for 3 days, or a slightly less shitty ship for 3 weeks?
Yeah.
And also those animals that are coming from most of those countries, with a few exceptions, are going from like to like. So they're going from the same climate to the same climate, and they're going from no stun to no stun. They're no worse off for being exported, whereas exporting hundreds of thousands of sheep from Australia who would have at least been stunned and spared the voyage for 3 weeks at sea to the Middle East to have their throats cut whilst fully conscious is a net animal welfare loss, and the industry just won't admit that.
So I'm trying to get my head around what happens here in Australia. How big is the export industry here in Australia? And what do you think the actual impact of the phase out is going to be?
Depends who you listen to, really. The sheep producers will tell you it'll be the ruination of the entire sheep industry across Australia.
We're quite happy about that.
Yeah. But, also we want to look after our farmers and help them transition to more ethical, alternative ways to make a living. Most of them do it because it's in the family and their fathers did it and their grandfathers did it, or mothers or grandmothers. But I guess I look at it and go, well, in 2002, we were exporting over 6 million head of sheep, and that dropped from 6 million to under 500,000 in 2022. It rose a bit in 2023. But if the decline from 6 million to 500,000 hasn't killed the sheep industry, I don't see how that last 500,000 will, especially when chilled meat exports are booming. So all they have to do is take the money that the government is giving them. And I think you have to remember that the UK essentially banned live exports overnight, and that was worth about, in Australian dollars, nearly $1 billion, 900,000 something dollars Australian. They banned that overnight, no compensation to the farmers. New Zealand banned all live exports by sea. In a 2-year period, that was worth about $400,000 Australian. 2 years, no compensation to farmers. Australia is banning an industry that's worth 50 to 70 million. Sorry, did I say New Zealand was
400
million? Yeah.
Okay.
And UK was like 900 million, so nearly $1 billion. The Australian live sheep trade is worth about 50 to 70 million, and they're getting 4 years and $139 million compensation. So really, just shut up, stop whinging, and get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings us to, how can Australian farmers move beyond supplying the live animal export trade to other methods of farming and other trade exports?
Well, ideally, I think we have sunshine. We have a lot of water in parts of the country. Think of the Ord River. I think we're in a great position to, invest in the plant-based proteins and milks and egg replacement production and be shipping that to the rest of the world. you can do it hydroponically, so you can save on land, you can save on water, and it's a cleaner protein. So I would love to see investment in that from a future government, and as well as that, see them slapping a health tax basically on animal products to cover the costs of healthcare for animal protein related diseases. And I think at the moment it's an economy of scale, so we need a wider variety of delicious plant-based products in the supermarkets that the general public has access to, and they need to be cheaper than the animal alternatives. But for them to become cheaper, we need more people buying them. So it's kind of a, excuse the analogy, but a chicken or the egg thing. But I think, that's the way of the future, especially in relation to the climate crisis. We need to invest more and focus more on plant-based products. And most of the apart from the northern cattle, when you think about the southern Australian producers that farm sheep and cattle, they're on prime productive agricultural land. And really the only issue is water supply to grow the crops that produce the beans and legumes and, wheat, which we already have an abundance of to make these protein products. So that's the direction I'd like to see it go in. At the moment, I think with the chilled meat trade booming, that's what they need to focus on if they want to stay in the sheep industry. And that'll be profitable. I mean, last year, and sorry again to talk about chilled meat, but just being pragmatic, last year the chilled meat export trade from Australia was worth 17 billion, and the total value of all live animal exports from Australia was worth about 1.8 billion. So it's a huge industry. We ship chilled meat to every country that we export live animals to, apart from Israel. So I think they need to focus on that, growing that, and hopefully we get more progressive government and more MPs elected, Greens MPs, Animal Justice Party MPs, any MPs that are more progressive and really want to take a stand against the climate crisis and focus on Australia's part in promoting animal-based proteins and meat alternatives and dairy alternatives.
Well, it's really interesting, like you talking about all the different crops and legumes and all these sorts of things. I've often been saying to people that Australia could become the hemp capital of the world, because we have a lot of the producers, the animal producers, will say, that nothing can grow on the ground, and we know that a lot of the cattle, because they've got hard hooves, and same with sheep, they destroy the ground. But things like hemp and black sesame can grow pretty much anywhere. They get 3 profitable, like highly profitable yields every year. To me, it's a no-brainer.
No-brainer. I've invested a fair bit of money in Hemp in Tasmania, which is a women-owned hemp industry that primarily focuses on hemp for the building industry. But of course, I also eat hemp seeds, and it can make clothing and paper, and it's the building hemp though is amazing. It's fire retardant, which is what we need in Australia. So it really is the way of the future. And yeah, that's an industry that many producers, they go, the land's stuffed and we can't grow anything on it. It's like, well, you probably grow hemp and you don't need much water, and it's pest resistant, and it's it'd be a profitable crop to get into. So I'd love to see that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing just to quickly mention is a lot of these properties are absolutely stunning, picturesque properties. There would be a market for ecotourism, for glamping, for hiking, for bird watching, all of that kind of thing. The opportunities are endless if you're able to broaden your thinking.
That's it. And I think, farmers in Australia have always prided themselves on thinking outside the box and facing any challenges and evolving and adapting. And it's like, we're just going to have to keep doing it. We got rid of other industries that were unethical, like whaling, and I'm sure there are people who are making money out of whaling as well. But should we have kept it going so they could keep making money? No, because financial incentives and financial considerations can't trump animal welfare.
Mm.
And I think this is the other thing too, when you talk about the financial side of it, quite often these industries are propped up by the government when there are things like drought or floods or fires. You know, they will be getting handouts from the government, and we just keep giving taxpayers' money to them. So it just seems ridiculous that we keep throwing money at a dying industry.
I think it's fine to give farmers drought relief once, and if they go back to the same area and do the same thing and they get flooded or, you know, burnt or droughted out or flooded out, again, after you've just given them money to help them in that situation, if they just want to keep getting the money and keep doing the same thing, then no, they've got to evolve and adapt and, you know, adapt to the climate challenges, adapt to the market, adapt to, you know, one of the big arguments is, the Australian public, they're all city slicking, latte sipping, bloody hippie, whatever, greenies. They don't know anything about farming. It's like, well, no, but, you know, we're all Australians and it's ruining Australia's reputation. Why not be clean and green and proud of what we do?
Yeah, definitely. So some vegans and animal activists don't like to talk about live exports or these so-called single issue campaigns. So could you share your thoughts on this?
Sure. I have copped some flack in the past from vegans who think it's, you know, who question why I'm essentially promoting domestic slaughter. But the point is that there are two alternatives. There's slaughter them here or send them overseas. There's no third option currently, that is to just not slaughter them. We're all working towards that. But it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. So if animals are going to get slaughtered, all welfare considerations, all veterinary expertise says that you have to slaughter them as close to farm as possible. So I see it not as a welfarist policy, not as a welfarist issue, not as a single issue campaign, but as an incremental campaign. So if something is bad and you can't eliminate it, you make it better. In the interim, while we all work towards abolition and the end of speciesism. So live export is one of those issues. People are making money from it. They're animals that may have been stunned and slaughtered here. They're being sent overseas because some countries like to get live animals. And I think it's, you know, the public has seen a lot of footage, but I've probably seen a lot of footage that didn't make it onto the TV because it was too horrible. And I've talked to the people that have seen it firsthand. And it's just the most egregious and unnecessary animal cruelty and suffering you can imagine. So can we just get rid of that first, work on the worst, work our way down to the best practice, you know, the RSPCA approved piggeries and all that, and eventually get rid of them. But I think you have to ask yourself, if I was an animal and I was in this situation and someone said, well, you're going to be killed, you're going to have your throat cut, but we can put you on a ship for 3 weeks and then you can be completely aware while they cut your throat, or we can put you on a truck for 3 hours and send you to a slaughterhouse where someone will stick a bolt in your head and you won't know what's happening. I'd go, okay, well, I don't want either, but can I have the latter, please?
Yeah.
Well, no one wants, you know, you can't humanely take the life of someone who doesn't want to die, but animals are going to die. They're going to be killed by humans. So in the interim, can we please do it with the least amount of trauma and suffering and pain as possible?
I think,
Coming from a vegan, but
yeah.
I'm just pragmatic.
Well, I think that's sort of a nice way to round off, well, as nice as possible of rounding off a very heavy topic. And we're so grateful for you coming on and talking to us about it. It's certainly opened my eyes to so many things. Before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to share?
I don't think so. Well, mate, you know, if you're vegan and you're watching this, you know, we're all vegan, we're all for abolition, but, you know, there are a multitude of issues under the umbrella of speciesism and animal exploitation, animal commodification and animal harm and animal suffering. And we want to end it all, but really you have to start with picking the low-hanging fruit, because all of it's not going to end overnight. And I think this is a campaign that has the majority of the Australian public on side, so it's an easier one to end, which we have now finally seen with Labor's commitment to end at least live sheep exports. So, it's a political issue. Every animal issue is really a political issue because of they're covered by legislation and regulations and all that. So find your MPs and senators that support what you support and vote for them, and don't vote for the ones that don't support what you support or don't have the vision that you do, or pick the best of a bad bunch. It's never going to be perfect. I certainly don't think in my lifetime I'm going to see the end of speciesism and commodification and exploitation, but we just have to make the improvements we can.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all good and well to be abolitionist and to strive for those ideals. We would all love to see a fully vegan world, and we hope for that. But I appreciate so much that you have touched today on some of those incremental steps that we can take to hopefully get there a little bit sooner.
Sure. And we can take them without, promoting the practices that are still going to go on.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely step by step. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen.
So how can people get in contact with you if they want to, like email, website, social media?
Can't really, leave me alone. I don't work for Stop Live Exports anymore. I'm just an independent consultant working with all those other organisations. But feel free to contact me on my personal Facebook page or Blue Sky page or Instagram page, which I hardly ever use. I should be pretty easy to find. Or, through you, if anyone wants to go deeper into live exports, I'm happy for you to give them my contact details.
Thank you. We can put your Facebook profile and your Blue Sky profile in the show notes if you're happy for people to contact you that way as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Katrina. This has been, as I said before, an absolute eye-opener. We so appreciate your time and giving us your valuable time. I did see Avery, your dog, wandering around in the background a couple of times. And, of course, you do have your own rescue sheep, which I love seeing all the footage that you put up. It just makes my day. I smile. And I remember seeing them when they were, what do you call it, sproiking along the ground?
Yeah, they still do that, but they're about, Buster's about 80 to 90 kilos now, and he still sproinks.
Yeah.
But yeah, Buster and Lucille, who are Dorpers, and Tobias, who's a black-faced Suffolk, and Buster and Lucille were rescued by someone up in the north of Tasmania and needed someone to raise them as lambs, so I took them on and kept them. And Tobias was acquired from someone who wanted to sell him for breeding, and I said, don't do that. I'll take him and I'll give him a good forever life. So I've only got 3. I've got 4 acres, room for more, and I'll slowly take on a few more, but I don't want to end up with a sanctuary because I'm past the age of doing that. But yeah, that's certainly given me probably a very good insight into the lives and minds of sheep, and then knowing what they're subjected to on ships and at slaughter. It's heartbreaking. It's be like watching your dog having to go through that, because they're just as intelligent and funny and affectionate and individual as any dogs are.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Katrina. We appreciate your time. We appreciate everything you're doing for animals. Thank you for joining us today. And that wraps up another episode of the Vegan Compass podcast.
So
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely our pleasure. And we look forward for our next episode that will be coming up a week later after this one.
Yep.
So thanks, guys. Thanks for being with us. And we will see you all again soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Vegan Compass podcast, unveiling truths, inspiring change.
Be sure to follow us on social media at @thevegancompass_podcast. See you next time.